Hey guys, it's Timothy here, and I am doing a standard deck tech, something that you can play at game day if you're looking for kind of a little bit of a brew, something to go off the deep end, really. It is an Eldrazi ramp deck. It is a blue-green deck, and as I'll show you here in a couple minutes, the vast majority of it survives the next rotation, which isn't for a while. We've still got about a month and a half, 2 months before Kaladesh comes out and before Origins and Dragons of Tarkir kicks the bucket for Standard. But I like to build my most recent Standard decks with that in mind. I don't really want to invest into a lot of cards that are going to rotate so shortly. So you'll see the majority of this card, with the exception, or majority of this deck, with the exception of 2 cards, is ready for post-rotation. Not mentioning that we don't know what we're getting from Kaladesh, so there may be cards to fit the deck. Last thing I'll say before I jump into it is that the deck is also kind of a blueprint. I haven't played much with it, but I would like feedback on it. I would like to hear what you think could improve it, or what you like about it, and how you think it would match up with certain decks in the meta. So like, comment, and subscribe, and keep that in mind that I am looking for feedback on this as well. It is not a perfect deck. It is not necessarily tier 1 either, but it is fun as hell, and I wanted to share it with everybody. Now, why should you be playing this deck in the first place? First off, like I said, it's 95% ready for post-rotation. 96, actually. But it's going to survive Dragons of Tarkir and Origins rotating, which is great. It provides a lot of options and flexibility. You'll see when you see the deck list here in a second that most cards in the deck provide an opportunity for you to do multiple different things, and it requires you to kind of assess the battlefield and see which is the better to do. Those are my favorite type of decks to play, the ones where there are always options with your cards, and there's a lot of flexibility in the individual card effects. And also, we're playing Kiora, and Kiora needs some love. I can't think of the last Planeswalker that just nobody ever wanted to play, so we had to make a deck to fit Kiora in it, honestly. Alright, to the deck list. I've got it thrown out here. I'm going to go ahead through the individual card choices. It is laid out by mana cost at the moment. Spells and creatures are lumped together, so forgive me for that. But let's start with Oath of Nissa. This is one of my favorite cards in Standard at the moment. I can see myself playing it in Modern, but it's just great card selection. It lets us get a land if that's really what we need to do, and we're not dropping creatures on turn 1, and sometimes with some of our tap lands, we won't be playing a creature on turn 2, so Oath of Nissa is a great card to play on turn 2. If we go turn 1 land, turn 2 tap land, it gives us something to do, and it helps us filter out what we need. You'll see there are a lot of ways to fetch up the individual Eldrazi in our deck, so we can actually pitch those to the bottom and prioritize early game creatures or lands if we need them. Oath of Nissa is awesome. I totally agree. It's very much like the Green Ponder, and it's perfect in this sort of deck. The single Traverse the Ulvenwald, I only play one Traverse the Ulvenwald in these kinds of decks because I like Oath of Nissa better, and I don't think you can necessarily dump 4 of each in a deck. Oath of Nissa also serves the extra purpose of getting enchantments in the graveyard if you draw multiples due to the legendary rule, which is essential for us casting our Emrakul early. Traverse the Ulvenwald does do something that Oath of Nissa doesn't, and that's once we've achieved Delirium, which is very doable in this deck, we can go fetch out whatever Eldrazi we need to try and win the game with. That in addition to that, Traverse is just a decent card if you're stuck on one color and you really need to go find the other color. It lets you do that, but it's normally a card that you hold in your hand until you have Delirium active, and it fetches you one of your win conditions. I don't know how often it's played in Standard at the moment, but I like the card. I just don't think it's something that you should jam 4 of while you have Oath of Nissa kind of doing a pseudo-better job at what Traverse is doing in the early game. Hedron Crawler, Draft Extraordinaire, is in this deck, and I'm jamming 4 of them in the deck. Why am I doing that? Well, first off, there are a lot of 2-mana accelerators in Standard at the moment. I could have easily played Deathcap Cultivator or Ulvenwald Captive or any other 2-mana creatures that ramp us ahead. The reason I'm doing Hedron Crawler is because it happens to be an artifact, so we don't mind using it early in the game for mana and then trading it off later. No, I'm sorry, not trading it off, but chumping with it later to get 2 card types in our graveyard. It is essential because it's one of the only 2 artifacts that I'm actually running in this deck in the first place, but it serves 2 purposes. One, it single-handedly gets Emrakul down to an 11 mana card, and second off, it does ramp us to our 4 drops, 4 drops and above 1 turn earlier, which is very, very nice. This could again be any other 2 mana accelerant, but I really, really like the guy. It's just a shame that he doesn't actually do anything in combat. Unsubstantiate is a 4 of in this deck as well, and the reason being is as you look through the list, you'll notice there's not a lot of interaction. I'm not really concerned about what my opponent's doing. I'm just trying to get an Emrakul or Ulamog down as soon as possible. But I can't just let anybody run me over. Sometimes I need to counter a Gideon or I don't know, an Avacyn or Gisela, maybe even a Spell Queller that's about to hit one of my key cards. Unsubstantiate is super flexible. It can help us stabilize against a creature that's beaten us down in the early game, or it can help be a pseudo counter spell if we really need to resolve something and our opponent's on a control deck. Grapple with the Past is a 2 of. I'm not super in love with this card, but it is, again, a 2-fold card. This slot could have gone to Anticipate, but I think Grapple with the Past is actually just better than Anticipate in this deck. What it does is it tosses 3 cards in our graveyard, and then we get to return a creature or land from our graveyard to our hand. This will very rarely miss. Whereas Anticipate never misses on a card, Grapple with the Past will get us something we really want. We won't always want a land. We'll usually want a creature back, I'm sure, but what Grapple does is it gets us closer to Emrakul and it gets us closer to Delirium. Again, this isn't necessarily a Delirium deck. I didn't call it green-white Delirium for a reason, but you'll see when we look at the sideboard that Delirium does matter, and of course our end game is to get that Emrakul out and win with it. Grapple with the Past does that. It's also one of the only few instants in this deck, the only one, in fact, besides Unsubstantiate, giving us a total of 6 instants and another way to get that card type in our graveyard in addition to whatever we hit. Sylvan Advocate is basically a concession to just how good the early game is with cards like this. Advocates block other advocates, and unless we're going against Dromoka's command deck, which honestly is a huge portion of the field, Advocate can hold down the early game quite well. It is one of the only cards in the deck that doesn't actually do anything with the rest of the deck. We are playing Lumber and Falls, but Sylvan Advocate is just such a good card in the early game, and again, we don't have a lot of interaction, so we need really solid early game creatures. I'm only playing 3 of them because, like I said, it doesn't do anything with the rest of our cards. It's just a solid card on its own. Noose Constrictor as a 2 of. The 1 Noose Constrictor takes the place of Sylvan Advocate, but having played Noose Constrictor in this deck, I really liked the way it worked and actually decided to play a second one in the deck. Now, the discard is obviously really good for Delirium. It's really good for getting Emrakul out. It lets us pitch multiple copies of Oath of Nissa, anything that we can't cast in our hand, anything that we're missing as far as Delirium goes. Noose Constrictor lets us pitch that while also getting a power boost. Noose Constrictor can attack through other early game Sylvan Advocates and can actually survive Dromoka's command fights because of the discard effect. Now, you can't obviously just abuse the discard effect unless it's going to get you exactly what you want for Emrakul, but it is a really nice effect to have in this deck, and I've been pretty impressed with the card in general. Shaman of the Forgotten Ways is a pet card of mine. This is easily replaceable, but I love the card so much, and it's a shame that it doesn't get played in pretty much any competitive standard deck. It is the only Dragons of Tarkir or Origins card on this entire list, hence the 95% post-rotation deck. But what this does is it ramps us ahead 2 for our late-game creatures. We're not playing counterspells, so we can't afford to just dirtle all day. We are going to be attacked, but this card is really, really nice at what it does, and it works in conjunction with Kiora exceptionally well, adding 4 mana per turn if we have them both on the field, and we use Kiora's plus ability. Coax from the Blind Eternities is kind of the reason I'm playing blue-green instead of red-green for this ramp version. What it does is lets us get an Eldrazi from exile, or it lets us grab one from our sideboard. We will be looking at the sideboard here in a second, but obviously it's a toolbox kind of card, and it helps us get back our threats if they've been exiled with cards like Anguished Unmaken or Stasis Snare. Especially nice against Stasis Snare because that's one of the cards people generally try to use to take out Emrakul. Apparently skipped Imprisoned in the Moon here, but Imprisoned in the Moon is a one of. It is a catch-all. I like to always play at least one kind of catch-all answer in my decks, whether it's something like Anguished Unmaken or Imprisoned in the Moon. But it does take care of pretty much any threat we need to take care of, whether it's a Gideon that's beating us down, or just a big creature that's gotten out of control, like maybe a Tireless Tracker or something. It is also, if we don't need it, we can pitch it to like Noose Constrictor or something like that and get that extra enchantment in our graveyard, since we're not really playing any other enchantments besides Oath of Nissa. To Kiora. Kiora is kind of a weak Planeswalker, and that's evident by the fact that she's not played at all. But her abilities are exceptionally good in this deck. Her +1 untaps one target creature and up to one target land. As far as creatures go, we want to be untapping either our Hedron Crawlers or Shaman of the Forgotten Ways so we can retap them for mana again. That's 2 mana off Crawlers and 4 mana off Shamans. Very, very easy to get a World Breaker or even an early Ulamog or Emrakul out if we're untapping Shaman with this. The -2 works nice in this deck as well. You reveal the top 4 cards of your library. You may put a creature card and or a land card from among them into your hand, then put the rest into your graveyard. So it's one of the only draw engines we have in the deck. Obviously you can't spam it over and over again, but the -2 here works nicely with Noose Constrictor. It works nicely with pretty much Emrakul, and any other cards we need to get into the graveyard are definitely doable by using Kiora's effect. It beats other kind of Delirium effects, and the nice thing about Kiora is it is the only Planeswalker in the deck, and Planeswalkers do count towards the reduction on Emrakul. So once your opponent decides to kill it, you're not only life you would, if your opponent had attacked you instead, you would have lost that life, but Planeswalker soaks up that damage, and it also gets you closer to Emrakul as well. Hedron Archive is kind of a staple for these sorts of lists. It's a very, very good card. It's another way for us to draw extra cards if we're really scrapped for cards in our hand. It's another way to get an artifact into the graveyard, and the turn after we cast a Hedron Archive, it's very, very easy to cast a World Breaker. World Breaker can often win a game by itself, or can at least get rid of a pesky permanent if it gets answered. Conduit of Ruin is a nice card that doesn't get played a lot in these sorts of decks, but I do really like it in this deck because of how it combines with Emrakul. It does fetch up to 5 creatures in our deck, including World Breaker, Emrakul, and Ulamog. Does put it on top of the deck as well, and then it reduces its cost the next turn. So with Emrakul, that's actually an 11 mana creature alongside Conduit, assuming it's the first creature we cast that turn. Plus Emrakul's cost reduction for any other creature types in our graveyard. So we can actually get out an Emrakul very, very early, even earlier than Ulamog. You might be wondering why there's only one Ulamog in the deck and there are 2 Emrakuls, and that's because I think Emrakul is actually a stronger card than Ulamog if you can cast it earlier. Ulamog, obviously, by the time you get to 10 mana, can just wreck a game by itself. Emrakul can do that earlier than Ulamog. If you've seen Emrakul at all in this format, it is fantastic, and it's very, very hard to beat. World Breaker is a very solid creature. It's another one of our late game threats. We can get it out earlier than either of the big bad boys there, and it, like I said, it deals with artifacts, enchantments, and lands when it comes down. It's also one of the only main board ways to deal with flyers, even though a lot of the flyers in this format are aggressive, and we could be dead before we hit a World Breaker. Noose Constrictor being the only other reach card in the main board here. World Breaker is also a recurrent threat. By the time we get World Breaker, we probably already have a land in our graveyard, but that last ability does help us kind of reach the delirium type effects if we are just missing a land in our graveyard. Finally, Ulamog and Emrakul, not much to say about them. They kind of justify themselves, but they're very, very powerful cards. They are game winners. A lot of times, casting an Ulamog is game, casting an Emrakul is game. And this is exactly what the whole deck is trying to work towards. Mostly Emrakul. You'll notice a lot of the cards in the decks, Grapple in the past, things like that, are geared towards Emrakul, but we can get Ulamog out very easily too. There's no Kozilek in the main board. I'm not a huge fan of that card, but there is one sitting in the sideboard. Alright, main deck out of the way. Let's go ahead and look at the land base. It's pretty simple. The backbone out of it is 12 basics and 6 dual lands, 5 islands, 7 forests, 2 woodland streams, and 4 lumber and falls. I will say I'm not a huge fan of the dual lands like woodland streams, so I don't play a full 4 of them. I don't think it's necessary in a 2-color deck either. The mana fixing is already pretty decent in a 2-color deck, and lumber and falls gives us another threat, which actually works alongside our Sylvan Advocate, as I mentioned. The rest of the mana base will be made up of 3 Evolving Wilds, 2 Spawning Beds, and 1 Gaia Reach Sanitarium. Sanitarium's just a solid utility card in any 2-color deck that doesn't have to stretch its mana. Evolving Wilds is obviously a really early way to get a land into the graveyard while also fixing our colors, and Spawning Bed is a good mid to late game way to get a land into our graveyard while also giving us either blockers if we need them, or additional ramp if we need to get that Ulamog out. Spawning Bed's actually a really nice card that I don't think has seen play because the ramp decks are kind of on the down. They've definitely fallen off. They're not very dominant anymore. But I do like the distribution of lands here. It works pretty fine. I've found that with cards like Grapple from the Past and Oath of Nissa, it's very, very rare that you are struggling for lands, even in a 24 land deck. You would assume with big threats like Ulamog that you would want maybe 25, even 26 lands, but I found that 24 is pretty decent and you can find your lands pretty easily. Moving on to the sideboard, the first 6 cards I'll mention here are all part of the Coax from the Blind Eternity package. Ulamog, Emrakul, and Kozilek all appear as a 1-of in the sideboard, which is really nice. It turns Coax into a tutor for any of those 3 cards, in addition to a 3rd World Breaker, an Endbringer, or a Void Winnower if you find that those are the cards that you need. Void Winnower is not necessarily a great card, but its stats are gigantic, and it does shut down a lot of cards. For instance, it shuts down Bruna and stops it from bringing back a Gisela. It shuts down Thalia's Lancers and stops it from fetching up a Gisela or a Bruna, so on and so forth. Stops Spell Quellers and Reflector Mages and a lot of hits from Bant Company. Endbringer is a concession to token decks, which, as I'll mention in just a second, we're kind of weak to those, and they are pretty strong in the format right now. Endbringer can help us take down little X1 type creatures, i.e. Nissa plant tokens or something along those lines. And then Kozilek is in the sideboard because sometimes you just need to draw a bunch of cards. And if you can cast Kozilek, it's still a 12/12 menace and very hard to deal with. Very strong card, just not as good as the other 2 big baddies. Ulamog and Emrakul are also in the sideboard alongside World Breaker, just as a way to fetch those creatures up from the sideboard if our main deck copies get dealt with. Coax from the Blind Eternity is a nice card that lets us find any one of these 6 cards depending on the situation. Other 1-ofs include Altered Ego and Jace, Unraveler of Secrets. Sneak peek at the next card down there. Altered Ego is actually not insane, but what it does do is in creature-based matchups, it lets us ensure that we have the biggest creature on the board and we have the best creature, especially if our opponent's playing something that really benefits us. If our opponent plays, for instance, a Tireless Tracker, we can ramp out a really big Altered Ego and make a bigger Tireless Tracker and chump them, making sure that we have the biggest creature on board. Same goes for something like Gisela. If our opponent wants to really fight us with a big Gisela, let's make an even bigger Gisela and try to take it out that way. It's nice that Altered Ego also works with the ramp cards in our deck. Shaman of the Forgotten Ways gets to ramp it ahead too, Hedron Crawler 1, so on and so forth. Jace is an additional planeswalker that's just really bad in a lot of matchups and really good in others. It's not particularly great against token matchups or Bant Company, so it stays in the sideboard here. But against any kind of mid-rangey deck, it's a pretty decent card to have. We can protect it a little bit, and it helps us kind of dig for our answers or just deal with our opponent's creatures. Autumnal Gloom is a 2-of here. It's very easy to flip in this deck, and once it does flip, it turns into a 4/4 hexproof creature, giving us a pretty reasonably early threat, early to mid-game threat. We can't actually use the black activation, but we're not actually using this card to fulfill our Delirium requirements. We're using it to benefit once we have it. So it's basically a 3-mana 4/4 hexproof creature, which is exceptionally good against a lot of decks, especially things like white-black control that don't have a lot of ways outside of Languish to deal with it. Ishkana is essentially here for the Spirit matchup or the black-white matchup. It matches up exceptionally well against Gisela, Archangel Avacyn, and Languish, so it deals with a lot of threats from the black-white matchup while also taking out cards like Spell Queller and Selfless Spirit and Rattle Chain, so on and so forth. The reach on it's really nice. The little token effects and the activated ability aren't really what we're doing here, but Delirium is super achievable in our deck, and I think Ishkana deserves its spot in the sideboard. The final 2 cards is an additional Imprisoned in the Moon in those matchups where your opponent just has something that you absolutely need to deal with, and 3 Gnarlwood Dryads for early game matchups. For instance, if your opponent's playing red-black vampires or something like that, super aggressive decks, the Gnarlwood Dryads can come in as a way to stave the early game and help you survive, while also being a decent threat once you've achieved Delirium. Couple alternatives that were considered here. These 5 cards in general, Oath of Jace, Crop Sigil, Contingency Plan, Terrarion, Pieces of the Puzzle, are all decent ways of getting to Delirium, but they're not very effective cards on their own, and decided not to play them in the main deck. Contingency Plan probably being the worst, but also being the best way of fixing your graveyard for a very early Emrakul or very early Delirium. These cards in general are just not ones I like very much, but I could see them slotting in here and there in the deck. Wharf Infiltrator is a card that I considered as another way to get Delirium while also possibly getting threats on board. A Looter's nice, and it will get past the majority of the field, but I think the card's just a little weak in general, and I like Noose Constrictor for the same kind of reasons I would like this card. Tamiyo and Nahiri could possibly be played in this deck off of Oath of Nissa without having to stretch the mana too much. You could also put in a couple basics in their additional color. Nahiri being 2 additional colors, though, really hurts it. But Nahiri seems like a great card for this deck, while Tamiyo might be a little weak, but helps us definitely stave the damage from a creature-based deck on the opponent's side of the field with her minus ability, while also helping us draw cards off of our creatures with the plus ability if we really, really need to. Unfortunately, it doesn't work well with Hedron Crawler, and most of our creatures will be tapping down for mana, so I decided Tamiyo probably sit on the sidelines this time. Finally, Reality Smasher, Drowner of Hope, or any kind of Eldrazi creature that fits into these powerful Eldrazi decks like Matter Reshaper, Thought-Knot Seer. These cards could easily go in the deck, but I feel like if you were playing Reality Smasher or Thought-Knot Seer, you're probably playing a completely different deck in general, and you're not trying to dirtle around and get on an Emrakul. So I felt like these cards should probably not make the cut here either. Finally, what are we strong against? I will say that we're strong against people's sideboard plans that they have generally for Eldrazi-based decks. Transgress the Mind and Infinite Obliteration often come in against these decks, but thanks to Coax from the Blind Eternities, we can actually get back a card that's hit from Transgress, or we can fetch up a creature that's been removed from our deck if our opponent decided to Infinite Obliteration us. Coax from the Blind Eternities helps us get around things really nicely. I already mentioned Stasis Snare is another card that kind of blanks next to Coax from the Blind Eternities. Also, mid-rangey decks, the type that play Tireless Trackers and Advocates and things like that, but aren't going for a super aggressive kill, we can usually outpace those and get our Emrakul out early and dominate the game from there. So we do have very high percentage against mid-range decks, kind of Sultai or black-green based decks. Our weaknesses, as I've probably mentioned all three at this point, token-based strategies, Secure the Waste, Nissa, Voice of Zendikar, even Gideon's Zero ability are pretty strong against us because we're not playing board wipes. So if our opponent just gets out tons and tons of creatures, it might be too late for our Emrakul or Ulamog to get the job done. Flyers can be a problem for us. We do have a couple reach threats in the main board, but only about 4 total. Ishkanah does help out of the sideboard, but it is possible to die to very early game flyers before we draw one of those threats or before we get going with our plan. And then finally, super aggressive decks, anything that's playing Reckless Bushwhacker or these vampire-based decks like Mono Red. I've seen a Mono Red vampire deck do really, really well. Or even red-black vampires. Super aggressive decks can get us before we've really gotten off our feet, forcing us to chump with things like Hedron Crawler much earlier than we want to, due to the amount of power and amount of damage they can put out early in the game. Alright, let me know what you guys think. If you've gotten to this point, I would love your feedback, and I want to thank you again for taking the time out of your day to watch this video. I know these videos go very long, but I do like to explain the individual choices so that people can ask questions and can give me accurate feedback and can kind of let me know what's either missing or what you really like about it. So please share your opinion below. Leave a comment and let me know what you think of the deck, and let me know how you think it would do. As I said, if you have any suggestions for cards that might go into this deck, please let me know. But keep in mind, I do want to keep this post-rotation. There are definitely cards that could fit the deck from Dragons and Origins, but that's not my intended purpose with this deck. Alright, my name is Timothy. Thanks again for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe, and I will catch you guys next time.